Shabbat Shalom. Baruch Hashem. I was quite intimidated 2 weeks ago when Rabbi Freeman came up and asked me to do this. And I said, well, Rabbi, you kind of caught me out of the blue. But as the Bible says, with Christ or with Yeshua, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Now, I grew up with black history. I am the great-grandson of slaves. My grandfather was a great man, and he's the one that taught me black history because they didn't teach it in the schools when I was coming up. I'm touching on 64 years old, so the Lord has blessed me in many ways, and I want to give full credit to my dear wife, without whom this production would not be possible. I'll tell you that right now. So. Black History Month celebrations have usually focused on slavery and its aftermath, the civil rights movement, and notable accomplishments by black Americans to the present day, and we will touch on those. We will start with an overview of the civil rights movement and then go back further to this country's beginnings. My presentation today will hopefully shine light on aspects of African American history that you may not be aware of, that Africans were in the New World before Europeans, and our history is connected with Spanish, European, Mexican, and Israeli history. Let's start with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a true drum major for justice. And as we'll see, he was not alone, but he led the battle. So let's start with this video clip.
Have you ever had to confront violence or the threat of physical harm? How did you feel, and what did you do? Putting his life on the line as the leader of the civil rights movement, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. maintained a firmly nonviolent philosophy. His tactics, unpopular with some, sent a powerful message and shed light on the real enemy, racism. Montgomery, Alabama, December 5, 1955, the fervent Baptist minister, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., spoke out to 5,000 gathered in a Baptist church about racial injustice. A local woman, Rosa Parks, had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white person, and King was one of the leaders calling for a citywide boycott of public transportation by blacks. Aware of the risks ahead, King said, "If a man doesn't have something that he'll die for, he isn't fit to live." Inspired by the nonviolent philosophy of India's nationalist leader, Mahatma Gandhi, and his own Christian faith, King preferred risking arrest and even death to using violence. The boycotters endured attacks by racist whites, and King's own home was bombed, but ultimately, the justice system declared Montgomery's bus segregation laws unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott was just the first of many actions King and other civil rights leaders organized. At the helm of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King rallied protesters to sit in at segregated lunch counters and public places in Birmingham, Alabama. He welcomed the arrest of protesters by police to bring publicity to injustice. Of course, not everyone agreed with King's approach. Malcolm X was a Muslim minister and leading activist for the Black nationalist and Black pride movements. Turning the other cheek was not on his agenda, and he let the media and political leaders know it. Malcolm X was not alone. Other activists and intellectuals questioned King's approach and demanded immediate equal rights at any cost. King's tactics in Birmingham did draw nationwide attention. Live television showed police turning dogs and fire hoses on the non-violent demonstrators, and King was jailed and criticized for endangering his constituents. For many Americans who were unaware of the extent of brutality toward blacks, these images shed light on the dark reality of racial inequality in their country. King's 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, written on scraps of newspaper from prison, said that people have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws. As soon as he was freed, King helped to organize a massive march on Washington. On August 28, 1963, 200,000 in attendance heard King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and it became one of the great speeches in American history.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood.
The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and King received the Nobel Peace Prize. On April 4, 1968, King was assassinated at a motel in Memphis, Tennessee, after delivering a speech in support of a labor strike. His death sparked riots across the country. Yet the practice of nonviolent direct action that King advocated eventually helped achieve many of the advances he sought, and is still used by groups seeking social justice the world over. Today, King is remembered as one of the most impactful figures in the history of race relations in the United States. "I have decided to stick with love," he said. "Hate is too great a burden to bear."
And what we'll go to next, there was a rabbi who spoke after Dr. King on the March on Washington. Rabbi Joachim Prinz spoke to the crowd gathered at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. the day Dr. Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. A survivor of the Holocaust, he refused to stand aside during the fight against injustice in America. Please run that clip now, please.
We spent some time this week marking the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and one of the most important speeches in the history of this country. But more than one man articulated a dream that day, even if the power of Martin Luther King overshadowed them. It was the toughest time slot of the day. Never mind having to follow Mahalia Jackson, the queen of gospel.
I wish I could sing.
Rabbi Joachim Prinz was the last man up before Martin Luther King.
I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime.
The horrors this rabbi witnessed in Nazi Germany in the 30s compelled him to challenge America in the 60s.
Bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problems. The most shameful and the most tragic problem is silence.
It was really marvelous to see 250,000 people.
Rabbi Israel Dresner, a protege of Prinz's, was standing just a few feet away on the podium that day and could feel the power of Prinz's message ripple through the crowd.
That really rang a bell because all sorts of clergy in America, they weren't racist, they weren't bigots personally, but they just kept their mouths shut.
As the wise man once said, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing.
Exactly, exactly.
Prinz was expelled from Germany in the late 30s and came to Newark, New Jersey.
My friend, Rabbi Prinz,
where his congregation welcomed the young Dr. King twice.
So there was a direct line between the Holocaust and the American civil rights struggle?
Absolutely. Jews are opposed to injustice. We are opposed to hatred and bigotry and bias and racism and exploitation and so forth. And that's what we're supposed to be opposed to.
America must not become a nation of onlookers.
As he had 3 decades before, Prinz refused to be silent and encouraged all Americans to speak up just as loudly.
America must not remain silent. Not merely black America.
Rabbi Joachim Prinz, 50 years ago this week.
I have one more video I want you to see on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King on Israel and anti-Semitism. Never forget the black civil rights movement arose from the church back in the 1940s and 50s, just like the Abolitionist movement before the Civil War arose in black and white churches, North and South. So we're going to key this video, and then we'll go on with my video presentation on Dr. King on Israel and anti-Semitism. Please run that clip, please.
The whole world must see that Israel must exist and has a right to exist and is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world.
My Jewish brothers and sisters said to me amid anti-Semitism anywhere, and we don't need your support, but would still take a stand against anti-Semitism because it's wrong, it's unjust, and it's evil.
You know, we're going to start with explorers from West Africa, some things you probably don't know. Now, when I was in school, everybody was taught that Columbus discovered America in 1492 and he sailed the ocean blue. Well, a couple of things. Columbus did not land in North America, he landed in the Caribbean. What if I told you that the first non-native explorers to the New World were seafaring men from West Africa? What evidence do we have to corroborate this statement? Now, this book, which came out in the 1980s, They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima. There's a list of historians and researchers that document this historical trend today. The first to bring this evidence to light is Ivan Van Sertima, author of They Came Before Columbus. How did these Africans get across the Atlantic Ocean? A good question. Here's a graphic image of an African trading ship. Experts say they were built of wood and held together not by nails but by palm fiber lashings, and some were as large as 70 tons. There's another example. Now, interestingly, historians and researchers also show that African explorers sailed the Indian Ocean between Africa and China, and Swahili men actually transported an elephant to China in one of these boats in the 13th century. Now, some of you will remember Dr. Thor Heyerdahl back in the 1970s with the Ra, that ship that he sailed from the coast of North Africa to Barbados before the rudder broke in the middle of the ocean. Those trade winds still carried him down to Barbados. And so the anthropologists feel that these African men hit those trade winds and carried them right down to the areas in Latin America and Mexico. Now, I'm going to show you a series of carved heads that have been found dating back to 800 to 700 BC of an African presence in North America. Now, this Dr. Van Sertima says that he discovered a large number of ancient carved heads and human likenesses in Mexico in the Gulf towns of La Venta, Tres Zapotes, and San Lorenzo in the Olmec heartland. Now, and there are a large number of these. Some of them are very small, others are extremely large. There was a cover shot in the Smithsonian magazine a couple of years ago. Let me see. The largest one you could set up here and it would cover this whole area. There's that large. Now you will note in the next slide the strong African features of the carved heads, all of which predate Christopher Columbus prior to 1492. The most fascinating in this series is a so-called Negroid rock mask located at Chalcazingo near Morelos, Mexico. Professor Gillette Griffin, curator at Princeton University Museum, dated this carving between 800 and 700 BC. Now here you see, if you can, to the upper right, you can see a hand seal near the top of this rock carving. Is dated from the 25th dynasty period when Nubian king Shabaka stamped his hand in wet clay beside that of Assyrian king Sennacherib to seal their truce. So this is similar to what they used back in the 25th dynasty period. That period refers to the kings of Kush, which included Nubia, who ruled all or part of Egypt from around 746 to 653 BC. This period parallels the Egyptian Third Intermediate Period, 1070 to 653 BC. Now, if you look on the next slide here, this carving is of the Sphinx of Taharka, again from the 25th dynasty, temple at Kawa. This image is from a British museum. Dr. A. Hyatt Verrill of the Museum of the American Indian says the native people in the lands in Central and South America and even southern Mexico worship black trader gods. Clearly, these natives could not have known what an African looked like without actually having encountered these explorers. There was no TV. There were no newspapers or magazines. Interestingly enough, they said these black men carried spears that were tipped in gold. Now, the next slide shows where these remains of these artifacts have been found. Mexico's Gulf Coast region, they're discovered in the Olmec Heartland, which is in the southern portion of Mexico's Gulf Coast region, between the Tuxtla Mountains and the Olmec archaeological site of La Venta. But you can see from that map, now you can't see Africa, but we can see how these southern trade winds, we're going to run out of time, I don't want to get tired of it, how the trade winds carried these men down there and traded goods, and how many of them intermarried with the tribes there. So, who discovered America? For years, historians have debated over who discovered America, whether it was Christopher Columbus, Amerigo Vespucci, or the Vikings. One thing has become very clear: African explorers have been in the New World long before any of these gentlemen. Now, American history teaches that it was Columbus who discovered America and that he was on assignment from the King and Queen of Spain. But my next slide here is Columbus, Vespucci, and the Vikings. The next slide was Christopher Columbus Jewish. The scripture here is, the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like droplets on grass. That's from Micah, the 5th chapter, 6th verse. Now, some historians and Jewish scholars believe Christopher Columbus was Jewish, a converso who converted to Christianity to save his life or his position, but secretly kept the law of Moses at a time when thousands of Jews were being killed during the Spanish Inquisition. Many Jews who would not convert to the Catholic Church were forced to flee the country or be killed. There is historical speculation that Columbus sailed to the New World, not for jewels or a spice trade to India or China, but to find a new land where Jews could worship in peace. Now, how do we know this? While there is no historical evidence of Columbus's parentage, the fact that his voyage was financed not by the King and Queen of Spain, but by two wealthy Jewish businessmen and a rabbi in Spain, lends credence to the position that Christopher Columbus was, most likely, a Jew. Now, the first African to set foot in what later became the state of Texas was Estevan Eko, also known as Esteban. He was a Moor from Azanor, Morocco. Esteban accompanied the Spanish explorer Cabeza de Vaca and a group of officers in 1527 to what later became the state of Florida. Captured by Native Americans for several years, the group escaped and wandered along the Gulf Coast of Texas, eventually heading south to Mexico City. Noted for his skill in sign language, Esteban was chosen to guide an expedition which led to the discovery and mapping of what later became the state of New Mexico. He was killed by Zuni Pueblos. Africans also accompanied Balboa and Cortez to their expeditions to the New World. Now we come to slavery in America. There are going to be some facts here that are going to blow your minds. Now, most people think that the first African slaves came to Jamestown in 1609. That is not correct. The first African slaves in what would become the present-day United States of America arrived in 1526 with Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon's establishment of San Miguel de Guadalupe on the current Georgia or Carolina coast. These slaves rebelled, destroyed the colony in less than 2 months, and went off and lived with the Native Americans. But this rolls us back to before 1609, and actually large numbers of indentured servants. The first blacks that came here actually after this were indentured servants. They were not slaves, but let's move on. Slavery in America. Between 1525 and 1866, in the entire history of the slave trade to the New World, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. Of those, 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Just to show you the numbers of people that came to this country, less than 5% of that became slaves in North America. The rest became slaves in Cuba, the Caribbean, and Latin America, particularly Brazil, and their descendants are still with us today. Interesting, a number of about 18, 20, or 30, President Andrew Jackson ordered the 5 so-called civilized tribes to forcibly relocate to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Creek tribes brought 8,000 black slaves with them on the Trail of Tears, a brutal forced march that killed hundreds of men, women, and children. But many of these slaves intermarried with the Indians after 1865, and their free descendants became tribal officials and police officers. They called them light horse, like Cherokee and Creek light horse. That's what they call the police officers in Oklahoma. Now, this is a slave ship from Africa. You can see how the slaves were bound closely, chained together. I don't know how they survived. I really don't. You have to figure these people had to eat, relieve themselves. There were children with babies. They were soaked with water from the ocean currents flowing through the bilge of the ships. How they survived, I don't know. But it's the blessings of Adonai that we can stand here as free men and women, black and white, red, yellow, and brown, and worship Yeshua together. Now, I'll give you another little interesting fact that you may not be aware of. The first slave ships to arrive in North America from Europe contained white men, not Africans. The word slave was originally applied to white people, being derived from the German word Slav, an Eastern European people captured by the Germans. And to this day, the Eastern European and Russian peoples are referred to as Slavic peoples. It comes from that word, slave. These white slaves, mostly poor Englishmen who died like flies on the ships crossing the Atlantic. On one voyage, 1,100 out of 1,500 perished. On another, 350 out of 400. Some were indentured, but many, particularly the Irish, were held as slaves for life. Whites were legally sold as slaves in America from the early 1600s until 1826. As late as the Civil War, whites of the, quote, purest Nordic type were bought and sold like cattle, according to the memoirs of Union General and later U.S. President Ulysses Simpson Grant. There's some examples of white slavery in America. All those children were redeemed from slavery in New Orleans, Louisiana, along with that black man. Free blacks and prosperous Indians bought black and white slaves. By 1861, an estimated 4,000 to 6,000 free blacks owned slaves in the South. As early as 1670, Virginia passed a law forbidding Negroes from buying white slaves. Interestingly, if you read the law, it not only says Negroes are forbidden, but also Jews and Muslims are forbidden from buying white slaves. But good Christian whites could still buy and sell their own, so that was an exception in the law there. The practice was so common in Louisiana that the legislature passed a similar law there in 1818. Also in 1818, a white German woman named Salome Muller. Now, I can't confirm that she's Jewish. I know Muller is a very common name with German Jews, but I can't confirm that she was Jewish. But Salome Muller, who had been bootlegged and sold as a slave in Louisiana as a child after her indentured parents and sisters died, brought her case to the U.S. Supreme Court after a copy of her birth certificate was found in Bavaria showing her German heritage and free status. The High Court ordered her set free. Her children, however, remained slaves of her former master. Next one. There we go. This is about Sam McCullough and free black men in Texas. There were numbers of free blacks and mixed-race persons in Texas during the period of Spanish rule. By 1792, there were an estimated 400 black men, women, and children in Texas. Most were not treated like free whites, however. Their legal status was similar to that of Native Americans. During the Texas War for Independence, blacks fought on both sides. Mexico had declared slavery illegal in 1820 and treated free blacks more equitably than white Texans, where slavery was legally recognized until 1865. Now, this man, Sam McCullough, and that photograph comes from the Texas Historical Society, distinguished himself at the battles of Goliad and San Jacinto. McCullough was the first man wounded at Goliad on October 9, 1835. He later became a landowner, married a white woman, and fathered 4 children. His citizenship was never questioned, unlike other blacks in Texas after independence. Hendrick Arnold, whom I do not have a picture of, there's only one drawing of him, was another free black man who served as a scout and interpreter for Erasmus Deaf Smith. It's deaf, but in Texas you call it Deaf. At the siege of Bexar, cited for bravery in battle by Colonel Francis Johnson after the defeat of General Cos and the capture of San Antonio from Mexican forces, Arnold later fought the Battle of San Jacinto. He married Erasmus Smith's stepdaughter, Maria Ignacio Duran, the daughter of Guadalupe Ruiz Smith. Hendrick Arnold died in 1840 at his ranch near Bandera, Texas, and left no children. Slavery built America's economy. With cash crops of tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane, America's southern states became the economic engine of the burgeoning nation. Their fuel of choice? Human slavery. If the Confederacy had been a separate nation, it would have ranked as the 4th richest in the world at the start of the Civil War. The slave economy had been very good to American prosperity. By the start of the war, the South was producing 75% of the world's cotton and creating more millionaires per capita in the Mississippi River Valley than anywhere in the nation. Slaves represented the Southern planters' most significant investment and the bulk of their wealth. Interestingly, a slave who in 1820, you could buy a male slave in New Orleans for $500. By 1860, the price had gone up to $1,500. And if he was skilled, it cost you $3,000. Historian and author Edward E. Baptist explains how slavery helped the U.S. go from a colonial economy to the second biggest industrial economy in the world. And there you can see it, that's King Cotton. The Emancipation Movement in the 19th century America was pushed forward by many different forces. Black freedom fighters, white enlightened lawmakers, determined Christian liberators of captive slaves, and outspoken abolitionists, including an influential number who were black. Especially effective were former slaves such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Henry Box Brown. Sojourner Truth was an African-American abolitionist and women's rights activist. Truth was born into slavery in Swartzkill, Ulster County, New York, but escaped with her infant daughter to freedom in 1826. Benjamin Lay, a Quaker who saw slavery as a notorious sin, addressed the 1737 volume to Christians who pretend to claim they are pure and holy, but they still contain with the degradation of human slavery. Quaker petitions on behalf of the emancipation of African Americans flowed into colonial legislatures and later to the United States Congress. There's Henry Box Brown. He escaped to freedom at the age of 33 by arranging to have himself mailed in a wooden crate in 1849 from Virginia to abolitionists in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a journey which lasted 26 hours in a wooden box only 3 feet long, 2.5 feet deep, and 2 feet wide. That's quite an accomplishment. Jews in the abolitionist movement. This is Vilhelm Robb. He edited a German-language anti-slavery newspaper in Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and Baltimore. He became the victim of a pro-slavery mob in Baltimore in 1861, but he survived, although he was beaten up severely, but his press and his shop were burned to the ground. More Jews in the abolitionist movement, including, besides Vilhelm Robb, were Ernestine Rose, a Jewish woman born in Poland. She was described as a dazzling orator, utopian, and free thinker. Born in Poland, she traveled throughout the United States condemning slavery and agitating for women's rights. One pro-slavery ruffian accosted her in the South and threatened her, saying, "If you were a man, I'd tar and feather you." 3 Jewish men accompanied abolitionist John Brown on his raids to pro-slavery encampments in Bleeding, Kansas during the 1850s. August Bondy and Theodore Wiener rode with Brown until his arrest at Harper's Ferry and later execution. Moritz Pinner founded a bilingual abolitionist newspaper, the Kansas Post, and was a staunch Republican. Now, when I say bilingual, that means German and English. Rabbi Gustav Gottheil of Manchester, England, later New York, was an early Zionist. He wrote 2 sermons entitled Moses versus Slavery. How can we be silent when the Torah is invoked to condone an institution of which it is, in fact, one grand consistent utterance of condemnation? Moses Milzener earned his PhD in 1859 from the University of Gießen. He wrote in his dissertation, Slavery Amongst the Hebrews, no religion and no religion of ancient times could in its inmost spirit be so decidedly opposed to slavery as was the Mosaic. And no people looking at its own origin would find itself more strongly called to the removal of slavery than the people of Israel. And Bernard Felsenthal of Chicago, later one of the first Zionists in America, spoke forcefully against slavery. If anyone is a Jew above all others, who should have the most burning and irreconcilable hatred for the peculiar institution of the South. Now, I'm running out of time, but I do want to show you that the African presence in Europe, there were 2 black queens in Europe, and there was black presence in the legacy of the Portugal, England, France, and Spanish royal families. The first black queen was Queen Philippa Hainault, 1314 to 1369, wife of King Edward III. She was the daughter of Count Hainault in the Low Countries of Belgium, in an area once ruled by the Moorish African tribes. Now here she is painted with European features, but an eyewitness described her as having fine features, beautiful thick black hair, a flat but not blunt nose, full lips, well-developed limbs, and brown-skinned all over like her father. The next shot is our second black queen of England. This is Charlotta Sofia of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She was the wife of King George III. She was Queen of England and Ireland from 1761 until her death in 1818. She was descended from the African branch of the Portuguese royal house, and her mother was Margarita de Castro y Souza. Queen Charlotta bore 15 children, 13 of whom lived to adulthood. She was a devout Christian and studied the Bible almost daily. She was the grandmother of Queen Victoria and the great-great-great-grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, who sits on the throne of England today. The lost tribes of Israel, the Limba. The Limba are a tiny tribe of about 50,000, and a small portion of which reside in Soweto, South Africa, and the others in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. They speak a variety of Bantu languages, but claim to be descended from Israelites deported by King Nebuchadnezzar from Judea to southern Arabia, a land they call Sinai. Several tests of Limba male DNA reveal a mix of Semitic and Bantu markers at a 2-to-1 ratio. Almost 9% of all Limba males tested carried the Cohen modal haplotype, 2 to 3 times that of most Jewish populations. A Limba subgroup, the Buba, which means Judea in the Bantu language, carried the Cohen haplotype at percentages as high as Ashkenazi Kohanim. Over half the males in the Buba clan, 53%, had the priestly signature marker. They do not marry outside their tribes, and they practice male circumcision. I'm going to delete the rest of that, but they do adhere to the Levitical laws, and the tribal name Limba means people who refuse. My source here is a fascinating book, Abraham's Children, Race, Identity, and the DNA of the Chosen People by John Enteen from Grand Central Publishing. As biblical evidence, the Limba people cite Ezra 2:35 and Nehemiah 7:38, where the scriptures say almost 3,930 sons of Sanaa returned from exile in 538 BCE at the behest of Persian King Cyrus to rebuild the temple the Babylonians had destroyed. I don't think I'm going to be able to get through this, but I'm going to try. All right. Now, I know that many Jews felt abandoned by the Western powers because the Holocaust went on so long before the U.S. Army and the Russians got to liberating the camps, but it was not an easy process. Now, I'm going to read to you the distinguished, the presidential unit citation given by President James Earl Carter in 1976 to the 761st Tank Battalion of the U.S. Army. These guys are the original Black Panthers. They fought nonstop for 183 days from October 31st, 1944 until May 6, 1945 against units of 14 different German divisions, including SS Panzer divisions. They broke the Nazi ring around Bastogne, freeing the 101st Airborne during the Battle of the Bulge, and spearheaded the Allied breach of the Siegfried Line and the race to the Rhine River. These men suffered 50% casualties and lost 71 of their 100 tanks. Now I'm going to read this. I was going to go with the Tuskegee Airmen. They also served bravely, and they shot down 138 German planes and destroyed another 273 on the ground. They also shot down the first 4 German Me-262 jet fighters that were downed by American pilots, were downed by the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Squadron. But this is pretty good for men who, before the war, said the African Americans didn't have the mental capacity to fly a plane or operate a tank. Anyway. I want to read this to you. This is from a book by David Williams, their white commander, called Hit Hard. I bought it back in the 1970s. I still have it. But I want you to read this to you about exactly what these men accomplished. And remember, the Sherman tanks that they had were only about 36 tons with a 76 millimeter gun. They had to go up against German Panther and Tiger tanks with 4 inches of sloped armor and 75 and 88 millimeter high velocity guns. And they could knock out these American tanks at over a mile. The 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps displayed in the accomplishments of unusually difficult and hazardous operations in the European Theater of Operations from 31st October 1944 to 6 May 1945. During 183 days of combat, elements of the 761st, the 1st United States Army Tank Battalion committed to battle comprised of black soldiers. They're responsible for inflicting thousands of enemy casualties, for capturing, destroying, or aiding in the liberation of more than 30 major towns, 4 airfields, 3 ammunition supply dumps, 461 wheeled vehicles, 34 tanks, 113 large guns, 1 radio station, and numerous individual and crew-served weapons. This was accomplished while enduring an overall casualty rate approaching 50%, and the loss of 71 tanks in spite of extremely adverse weather conditions, very difficult terrain not suited to armor operations, heavily fortified enemy positions and units, and extreme shortages of replacement personnel and equipment. The accomplishments are outstanding examples of the indomitable spirit and heroism displayed by the tank crews of the 761st. In one of the first major combat actions of the 761st in the vicinity of Vic-sur-Seille and Morville-les-Vic, France, the battalions faced a reinforced German division. Despite the overwhelming superiority of the enemy forces, elements of the battalion initiated a furious and persistent attack, which caused defending enemy units to withdraw. While pursuing, the enemy tanks of the 761st were immobilized before an anti-tank ditch. Savage fire from enemy bazooka and rocket launcher teams positioned 50 yards beyond the ditch disabled many of the vehicles. Crewmen dismounted the disabled tanks, crawled under them with their 50 caliber heavy machine guns, and placed withering fire upon the enemy positions. This resulted, let's see if I got a, nope, that's wrong, go back. This resulted in the elimination of many of the positions and virtually destroyed 2 enemy companies while permitting the escape of other tanks and crews and eventual completion of the mission. From 5th January 1945 to 9th January, the 761st engaged the 15th SS Panzer Division in the vicinity of Tillet, Belgium. Suffering severe casualties and damage to their tanks, the 761st attacked and counterattacked throughout the 5-day period against a numerically superior force, both in personnel and equipment. And on 9th January, the men of the 761st routed the enemy from Tillet and captured the town. This action was significant in that the enemy was prevented from further resupply of its forces encircling Bastogne and the United States troops there because of the closing of the Brussels-Bastogne highway by the men of the 761st. One of the most significant accomplishments of the 761st started 20th March 1945. Acting as the armored spearhead, the unit broke through the Siegfried Line into the Rhine Plain, allowing units of General Patton's 4th Armored Division to move through to the Rhine River. During the period 20th March 45 to 23rd March, the battalion operating far in advance of friendly artillery encountered the fiercest enemy resistance in the most heavily defended area of the war theater. Throughout the 72-hour period of attack, elements of the 761st assaulted and destroyed enemy fortifications with a speed and intensity that enabled the capture or destruction of 7 Siegfried towns, 31 pillboxes, 41 machine gun emplacements, 61 anti-tank guns, 451 vehicles, 11 ammunition trucks, 4 self-propelled guns, 175 millimeter artillery piece, 200 horses, and 1 ammunition dump. Enemy casualties totaled well over 4,000, and of those captured, it was determined that the 761st in its Siegfried Line attack had faced elements of 14 different German divisions. The accomplishments of the 761st in the Siegfried area were truly magnificent, as the successful crossing of the Rhine River into Germany was totally dependent on the completion of their mission. They fought in 183 continuous days in combat. They fought major engagements in 6 European countries, participated in 4 major Allied campaigns, and on 6 May 1945, as the easternmost American soldiers in Austria, they ended their combat mission by joining with the 1st Ukrainian Army from Russia at the Inn River in Steyr, Austria. Throughout this period of combat, the courageous and professional actions of the members of the Black Panther Battalion, coupled with their indomitable fighting spirit and devotion to duty, reflect great credit on the 761st, the United States Army, and this nation. Signed, Jimmy Carter. Now, a little historical note. Yeah, give him a hand. Give him a hand. Yeah, indeed, indeed. But they didn't stop there. There was a historical correction. The 761st did not liberate the Buchenwald concentration camp. They did liberate a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp at Gunskirchen on May 1st. And one young Jewish woman, 17-year-old Sonia Schreiber-Weitz, described the soldier who saved her in the poem, The Black Messiah. A black GI stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die. I thought he must be the Messiah. The soldiers of the 761st received a total of 2 medals of honor, posthumously 11 silver stars, 69 bronze stars, and over 300 Purple Hearts. Now, we're kind of running out of time here, but I did have some famous black scientists here and inventors. George Washington Carver, many experiments on the peanut and products. Madam C.J. Walker in hair care. Elijah McCoy, who patented numerous devices to lubricate locomotives and also invented the ironing board and lawn sprinklers. Percy Julian, an African-American chemist, was pioneering the chemical synthesis of medicinal drugs such as cortisone, steroids, and birth control pills. He also helped synthesize drugs to treat glaucoma and arthritis. Although he was discriminated against, he was not allowed to attend high school, but he went on to finish his PhD. And you can see that postage stamp dedicated to him. Dr. George Carruthers, who still teaches this day at Howard University, created inventions such as the ultraviolet camera or spectrograph, which was used by NASA in the 1972 Apollo 16 flight, revealing the mysteries of space and the Earth's atmosphere. He built his own telescope at the age of 10. He earned his PhD in aeronautical and astronomical engineering at the University of Illinois. In 1964, he began working at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory. His telescope and image converter was used to identify molecular hydrogen in space, and his ultraviolet camera spectrograph was used by Apollo 16 during the flight to the moon. Like I say, he still teaches at Howard University. Now, this next man is truly extraordinary, and there's a family connection here because my mother, who typed the plans for the atomic bombs at the University of Chicago Department of Metallurgy, she worked alongside Dr. Jesse Ernest Wilkins, Jr. This man attended the University of Chicago at the age of 13. Becoming the youngest student ever there, his intelligence led him to be called the Negro genius in the media. He received his PhD at 18. As part of a widely varied and notable career, Wilkins contributed to the Manhattan Project during the Second World War. He also gained fame working in conducting nuclear physics research in both academia and industry. He wrote numerous scientific papers, served in various important posts, earned several significant awards, and helped recruit minority students into the sciences. His career spanned 7 decades and included significant contributions to pure and applied mathematics, civil and nuclear engineering, and optics. Despite his great stature and fame during his various careers, he was often the target of unchecked racism. The guy who started it all was Benjamin Banneker. He lived 1731 to 1806. He surveyed the site for the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. He also constructed a clock that struck hourly. He was a multi-talented person who self-educated himself in astronomy and mathematics. He was also a writer, compiler of almanacs, and surveyor and inventor. At 24, he observed a wristwatch and used it to construct his own clock from wood which struck on the hour. He created puzzles for trigonometry which demonstrated his knowledge of logarithms. Banneker also attempted to find the exact length of an equilateral triangle, which is inscribed within a circle where the diameter of a circle is known. He brought about positive contributions in mathematics years before any other black mathematicians came to light. He was a great American. The next man, Lewis Latimer, collaborated with science greats Hiram Maxim and Thomas Edison. One of Mr. Latimer's greatest inventions was a carbon filament, a vital component of the light bulb. His inventions didn't stop there. He worked with Alexander Graham Bell and helped draft the patent for Bell's design of the telephone. He also invented an improved railroad car bathroom and an early air conditioning unit. Granville, yeah, we love that down here in Texas in the summer. I know that's right. Granville Woods was born to free African-American parents, held various engineering and industrial jobs before establishing a company to develop electrical apparatuses. Known as the Black Edison, he registered nearly 60 patents in his lifetime, including a telephone transmitter, a trolley wheel, and the multiplex telegraph, over which he defeated a lawsuit by Thomas Edison. Garrett Morgan was a great scientist, blazed a trail for African-American inventors with his patents, including those for a hair straightening product, a breathing device, a revamped sewing machine, and an improved traffic signal. He invented the first automatic 3-way traffic signal, which he eventually sold to General Electric, and he was the first black man in Cleveland, Ohio to own a car. So I hope I haven't exhausted you too much with a litany. We've only barely scratched the surface of African-American history, but I want to finish with the book of Isaiah, the 11th chapter, verses 11 to 12. I hope you can see that this country was made, it was by everybody, by men and women of all races and all faiths. Despite our problems, despite racism and violence, we've come together to create the greatest country in the world. I don't say that. People who raised me were the sons and daughters and the grandsons and granddaughters of American slaves, that I can stand up here and talk to you today and look out in this crowd and see every color of the rainbow. I think Adonai is very happy. So I'm sorry, Rabbi, to run on a little bit, but on that day, Adonai will raise his hand again a second time to reclaim the remnant of his people who remained from Ashur, Egypt, Patros, Ethiopia, Elam, Shinar, Hamat, and the islands of the sea. He will hoist a banner for the Goyim, assemble the dispersed of Israel, and gather the scattered of Yehudah from the four corners of the earth. And that's just what he's doing here. So God bless you, thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.